The clock struck midnight in Harlem, October 15, 1959. 7 different locations across the neighborhood were about to become crime scenes that would forever change the landscape of organized crime in New York City. But this wasn't random violence. This was calculated, methodical, and executed by a man who had turned warfare into an art form. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to the streets as Bumpy, was about to prove why they called him the gangster who never lost. In a single night, he would dismantle 7 criminal families, ending decades of territorial disputes and establishing a new order that would last for generations. But to understand the magnitude of what happened that October night, you need to understand what led to it. 3 months earlier, Bumpy Johnson had been sitting in his office above the Apollo Theater when his most trusted lieutenant, Willie Bishop, walked in with news that would set everything in motion. The Italian families weren't just trying to muscle into Harlem anymore. They were planning to eliminate every black numbers runner, every independent operator, every small-time hustler who wouldn't bend the knee. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about total domination. The meeting that started it all took place in a warehouse in Queens. 7 families had come together, something that rarely happened in the fractured world of organized crime. The Genovese family, the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Bonanos, the Colombos, and 2 powerful families from New Jersey that most people never heard of but controlled significant territory. They weren't meeting to divide up Harlem. They were meeting to erase it completely, to turn the most vibrant black community in America into just another Italian stronghold. Vincent Giganti, representing the Genovese family, laid out the plan. It was brutal in its simplicity. They would simultaneously hit every major black operation in Harlem. Numbers banks, policy wheels, loan operations, protection rackets, everything that generated revenue for the community would be destroyed in coordinated strikes. Anyone who resisted would be eliminated. Anyone who surrendered would work for them at a fraction of what they made before. It was economic warfare disguised as criminal enterprise. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that Bumpy Johnson had eyes and ears in places they never imagined. Maria Corsetti, a secretary who worked for the Lucchese family, had been feeding Bumpy information for 2 years. Not for money, not for protection, but because her younger brother had been saved by Bumpy when he overdosed on heroin that the families were pushing in Harlem schools. She'd been present at the warehouse meeting, taking notes that she believed were about legitimate business operations. When she realized what the notes actually contained, she made a phone call that changed everything. Bumpy received the information on July 18, 1959. He read Maria's detailed report 3 times before he fully grasped the scope of what was coming. This wasn't just another territorial grab. This was extinction. They weren't trying to cut him in or push him out. They were trying to erase everything he'd built, everything his community depended on, everything that kept Harlem from becoming another impoverished neighborhood with no economic independence. That night, Bumpy called a meeting of his own. Not in some warehouse or backroom, but in his apartment above the Cotton Club. Present were his most trusted associates: Willie Bishop, his strategic mind; James Lucas, his enforcer; Sarah Washington, who ran the women's network that controlled information flow throughout Harlem; and Marcus Thompson, who managed the legitimate businesses that provided cover for their operations. What happened in that room over the next 4 hours would become the blueprint for the most sophisticated criminal counterstrike in American history. Bumpy didn't just want to survive the Italian offensive. He wanted to make sure it could never happen again. His plan wasn't defensive. It was preemptive, comprehensive, and designed to send a message so clear, so devastating, that no one would ever again mistake his community for easy prey. He would hit all 7 families simultaneously, but not with guns and bombs. He would hit them where it hurt most: their money, their reputation, and their ability to operate. The first phase began immediately. Sarah Washington activated her network of domestic workers, secretaries, cleaning ladies, and service workers who moved through the Italian family's legitimate businesses like ghosts. Over the course of 2 months, they gathered intelligence on every major operation, every financial vulnerability, every personal weakness that could be exploited. They learned about Giuseppe Marconi's gambling addiction that had him in debt to loan sharks in Chicago. They discovered that Anthony Ricci was skimming from his own family's construction business to support a second family in Miami. They found out that the Lucchese family's numbers operation was being investigated by federal agents who had no idea how close they were to bringing down the entire organization. While the intelligence operation was running, Willie Bishop was orchestrating something even more ambitious. He was turning the families against each other. Using information gathered by Sarah's network, he began feeding carefully crafted lies to different family members. He convinced the Gambinos that the Genovese were planning to eliminate them after taking Harlem. He made the Bananos believe that their New Jersey partners were negotiating secret deals with federal prosecutors. He created suspicion, paranoia, and distrust that spread through the families like poison. But the masterstroke, the element that would make everything else possible, was what Bumpy did with Marcus Thompson's legitimate business network. Over the previous 5 years, they had quietly acquired interests in dozens of businesses that served the Italian families. Restaurants where they held meetings, laundromats that cleaned their money, trucking companies that moved their goods, even a funeral home that had handled their dead for decades. The families had no idea that their most trusted service providers were reporting directly to the man they were planning to destroy. As September turned to October, the final pieces were falling into place. Bumpy had identified the exact date of the planned offensive, October 16, 1959. The families would strike simultaneously at 3 a.m., when most of Harlem would be asleep and law enforcement would be at minimal staffing levels. It was a sound strategy, except that Bumpy Johnson was going to strike first. The night of October 15th began like any other. The families were making their final preparations, checking weapons, confirming targets, coordinating timing. They had no idea that their every move was being watched, recorded, and reported to a man who was already 12 hours ahead of them. At exactly midnight, Bumpy Johnson's counteroffensive began. The first target was the Gambino family's main numbers bank in Queens. James Lucas and 6 hand-picked men walked into what appeared to be a simple break-in. But this wasn't about stealing money. It was about information. They photographed every record, every ledger, every piece of evidence that connected the operation to legitimate businesses throughout New York. Then they did something unexpected. They left everything exactly as they found it, except for one small detail. They planted evidence that made it look like someone from inside the organization had been cooperating with federal investigators. Simultaneously, at a Genovese family restaurant in Little Italy, the evening was ending normally until the health inspector arrived for a surprise inspection. What he found would shut down the establishment for months. Health violations so extensive and well documented that even family lawyers couldn't make them disappear quickly. The inspector, of course, was a legitimate city employee who had received an anonymous tip that included photographs, detailed reports, and evidence that would stand up in any court. While those operations were unfolding, the most devastating blow was being delivered to the Lucchese family's construction business. A fire started in their equipment yard, destroying millions of dollars worth of machinery and vehicles. But this wasn't arson in any traditional sense. The fire was caused by an electrical short in a piece of equipment that had been subtly sabotaged weeks earlier by a maintenance worker who had no idea he was part of a larger operation. The insurance investigation would reveal so many safety violations and suspicious circumstances that the family would spend years in litigation, effectively ending their construction operation. The Bonanno family discovered that their main source of legitimate income, a chain of bakeries throughout Brooklyn, had been infiltrated by health inspectors, tax auditors, and labor investigators simultaneously. Every violation that had been ignored for years was suddenly being prosecuted aggressively. Every corner that had been cut was being examined under a microscope. Every bribe that had been paid was being traced and documented by investigators who seemed to have unlimited resources and information. The 2 New Jersey families found themselves facing their worst nightmare: federal attention. Evidence of their interstate criminal activities was simultaneously delivered to FBI offices in New York and New Jersey, along with detailed documentation of how their operations connected to organized crime families throughout the Northeast. The evidence was so comprehensive, so well organized, and so legally sound that federal prosecutors would later say it read like a professional investigation that had been ongoing for years. But the most personal blow was delivered to Vincent Gigante himself. The Genovese family boss arrived home that night to find his wife and children gone. Not kidnapped, not threatened, but relocated to a safe house by federal marshals who had received credible evidence that his life was in danger from rival crime families. The evidence was real, carefully constructed from intelligence that Sarah Washington's network had gathered about genuine threats from other organizations. Gigante would spend months in federal protection, while his empire crumbled around him. By dawn on October 16th, the day that was supposed to mark the end of black organized crime in Harlem, 7 Italian crime families were dealing with disasters that would occupy them for years. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't finished. The most important part of his plan was just beginning. At exactly 9 a.m., as the families were trying to understand what had happened to them, every major newspaper in New York received detailed information about the planned offensive against Harlem. The leak didn't come from law enforcement or government sources. It came from what appeared to be a whistleblower within the Italian families themselves, someone who provided documentation, recordings, and evidence that painted a picture of a coordinated conspiracy to eliminate black businesses and terrorize an entire community. The public reaction was immediate and devastating. The Italian families, who had spent decades building legitimate fronts and public respectability, found themselves portrayed as racist conspirators attempting to destroy one of New York's most vibrant communities. Politicians who had been bought and paid for suddenly couldn't afford to be associated with them. Police officials who had been looking the other way were forced to launch investigations. Business partners who had been comfortable with quiet corruption suddenly faced public scrutiny that threatened their own reputations. But perhaps most damaging was what happened within the families themselves. The carefully planted seeds of suspicion and distrust that Willie Bishop had been cultivating for months suddenly bloomed into open warfare. Each family believed that one of the others had betrayed the entire conspiracy. Accusations flew. Alliances shattered. Violence erupted not between the families and Bumpy Johnson, but between the families themselves. Giuseppe Marconi, the Gambino soldier whose gambling addiction had been exposed, was found dead in his car 3 days later. The Bonanno family was convinced he had been eliminated by his own organization for bringing federal attention to their operations. The Lucchese's blamed the Genovese for the electrical fire that had destroyed their construction business, believing it was a deliberate attempt to eliminate a rival revenue source. The New Jersey families accused everyone else of setting them up to take the fall for the federal investigation. Within 2 weeks, the 7 families that had united to destroy Harlem were engaged in the bloodiest internal conflict in New York organized crime history. Territory that had been stable for decades was suddenly in dispute. Leadership that had been unquestioned was being challenged and eliminated. Revenue streams that had flowed smoothly for years were disrupted by violence, investigation, and internal warfare. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson was consolidating his position in ways that seemed almost magical to outside observers. The numbers operation that the families had planned to destroy was running more smoothly than ever. The independent operators they had planned to eliminate were organizing under Bumpy's protection into a confederation that was more powerful than any individual family. The community they had planned to terrorize was united behind a leader who had proven he could protect them from any threat. The success wasn't just about the October offensive, though. It was about what Bumpy did next. Instead of gloating or retaliating further, he reached out to the remnants of the Italian families with an offer that was as brilliant as it was unexpected. He proposed a division of territory that gave them control of areas where they were already established while establishing Harlem as permanently off-limits. More importantly, he offered to share intelligence about federal investigations and law enforcement activities that his network had uncovered. The offer was irresistible because it was based on demonstrated capability. Bumpy had shown that his intelligence network was superior to anything the families had. His ability to coordinate complex operations was unmatched. His understanding of legitimate business and legal vulnerabilities was comprehensive. Working with him wasn't just profitable. It was essential for survival in an environment where federal law enforcement was becoming increasingly sophisticated and aggressive. The new arrangement was formalized in a meeting at the Cotton Club on December 3, 1959. Representatives from the surviving leadership of all 7 families sat down with Bumpy Johnson to negotiate what would become known as the Harlem Accords. The agreement established principles that would govern organized crime in New York for the next 3 decades. First, territorial boundaries were clearly defined and mutually respected. Harlem was recognized as independent territory under Bumpy's control, while traditional Italian neighborhoods remained under family jurisdiction. Second, intelligence sharing was institutionalized through regular meetings and communication channels that helped all parties avoid law enforcement attention. Third, conflict resolution mechanisms were established to prevent the kind of misunderstandings and escalations that had nearly destroyed everyone involved. Most importantly, the Accords established a new model for organized crime that moved beyond simple territorial control towards sophisticated coordination of legitimate business interests. Bumpy's network of legal businesses became a model that other organizations began to emulate. His approach to community relations, which emphasized providing services and protection rather than simple exploitation, proved to be more sustainable and profitable than traditional methods. The impact of that October night extended far beyond New York. Word of what Bumpy Johnson had accomplished spread through organized crime communities across the country. The sophisticated intelligence gathering, the coordinated multi-front assault, the psychological warfare tactics, and the strategic use of legitimate business networks became a template that other organizations studied and adapted. Law enforcement officials, meanwhile, were dealing with the implications of a criminal organization that seemed to operate more like a government than a traditional crime family. Bumpy's network provided services that communities needed: economic opportunity, protection from predators, resolution of disputes that the legal system couldn't handle. Traditional law enforcement approaches that relied on community cooperation became ineffective when the community saw the criminal organization as more reliable and responsive than official institutions. The October offensive also marked a turning point in how organized crime related to broader social and political issues. Bumpy Johnson had framed his actions not just as criminal enterprise but as community defense. He had positioned himself as a protector of civil rights at a time when the civil rights movement was gaining momentum throughout the South. His success in defending Harlem from outside exploitation resonated with broader themes of self-determination and resistance to oppression that were becoming central to African American political consciousness. Federal investigators who studied the events later concluded that the October offensive represented the most sophisticated example of criminal strategic planning they had ever encountered. The coordination of intelligence gathering, psychological operations, legal manipulation, media management, and direct action created a template that would influence both criminal organizations and legitimate intelligence services for decades. But perhaps the most lasting impact was what happened to Harlem itself. The community that had been marked for elimination became stronger, more independent, and more prosperous than ever before. The economic networks that Bumpy had built to support his operations became genuine engines of community development. The intelligence capabilities that had been used to defend against the Italian families were redirected toward identifying opportunities for legitimate business development and political advancement. Young people in Harlem who had seen their community successfully defend itself against powerful outside forces began to think differently about what was possible. The success of the October offensive contributed to a sense of empowerment and possibility that would fuel the civil rights movement, black nationalism, and community organizing efforts throughout the 1960s. Years later, when historians and criminologists studied the events of October 15, 1959, they would identify it as the moment when organized crime evolved from simple territorial control to sophisticated intelligence-based operations. They would point to it as an example of how criminal organizations could become so embedded in community life that traditional law enforcement approaches became ineffective. They would analyze it as a case study in how individual leadership could transform entire organizational cultures and strategic approaches. But for the people who lived through it, for the families whose lives were protected and the community that was preserved, October 15, 1959, was simply the night that Bumpy Johnson proved why they called him the gangster who never lost. In a single coordinated operation, he had eliminated threats that had been building for years, established a new order that would last for decades, and demonstrated that intelligence, planning, and community support could triumph over superior numbers and traditional advantages. The 7 families that had united to destroy Harlem ended that night as broken, suspicious, internally conflicted organizations that would spend years rebuilding what they had lost in a few hours. Bumpy Johnson ended that night as the undisputed master of one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history, a position he would hold until his death in 1968. The gangster who never lost had, once again, turned certain defeat into overwhelming victory through the application of superior intelligence, strategic thinking, and an understanding that true power comes not from fear, but from the loyalty of people who know you will protect them when it matters most. In the weeks that followed the night of reckoning, Bumpy Johnson's transformation of Harlem's power structure became even more apparent. Where once there had been constant territorial disputes, protection racket wars, and the perpetual threat of outside intervention, there now existed a carefully orchestrated ecosystem that served both criminal enterprise and community needs in ways that previous generations of gangsters had never imagined possible. The genius of Bumpy's victory lay not just in its immediate tactical success, but in how he leveraged that success to fundamentally restructure the relationship between organized crime and the community it operated within. Rather than simply replacing one form of exploitation with another, he created a system where criminal enterprise became inseparable from community development, where the interests of the gangster and the interests of the neighborhood resident aligned in ways that made traditional law enforcement approaches largely ineffective. Consider how he transformed the numbers game, which had always been Harlem's most visible form of organized gambling. Previous operators had treated it as a simple extraction business: take bets, pay winners, pocket the difference, and use violence to enforce compliance. Bumpy revolutionized this approach by turning the numbers operation into something resembling a community investment fund. Winners weren't just paid their earnings, they were offered opportunities to reinvest those winnings into local businesses, real estate opportunities, or educational programs for their children. Losing players weren't simply squeezed for more money, they were offered employment opportunities, job training programs, or small business loans that would help them improve their economic situation. This wasn't altruism, it was the most sophisticated form of long-term strategic thinking that American organized crime had ever seen. By improving the economic prospects of his customer base, Bumpy ensured that more people had disposable income to spend on his various enterprises. By creating legitimate investment opportunities, he provided himself with multiple revenue streams and money laundering mechanisms that were nearly impossible for law enforcement to distinguish from genuine community development. By positioning himself as an economic development engine rather than simply a criminal operator, he made it extraordinarily difficult for anyone, whether rival gangs, law enforcement, or community leaders, to organize effective opposition against him. The sophistication of this approach became evident in how he handled the aftermath of his victory over the 7 families. Rather than simply absorbing their territories and operations, he offered the surviving leadership positions within his expanded organization, but only after they demonstrated their commitment to his community-focused business model. Former enemies found themselves managing scholarship funds, overseeing job training programs, and coordinating with legitimate businesses in ways that completely redefined what it meant to be a gangster in 1940s Harlem. Take the case of Vincent "Razor" DeMarco, who had been one of the most violent and feared enforcers for the Genovese family's Harlem operations. After the night of reckoning, DeMarco found himself facing a choice that perfectly illustrated Bumpy's strategic brilliance. He could continue operating as he always had, using violence and intimidation to extract money from desperate people, and faced the certain prospect of being eliminated by Bumpy's now dominant organization. Or he could accept a position managing what Bumpy called community security services, essentially transforming protection racket operations into legitimate neighborhood safety programs that coordinated with local businesses, schools, and community organizations to provide actual security services while generating revenue through voluntary contributions rather than extorted payments. DeMarco chose adaptation, and within 6 months he had transformed from a feared street thug into something resembling a community organizer with a criminal background. his security services, actually did make neighborhoods safer. His voluntary contributions were genuinely voluntary because businesses saw real value in the services provided, and his former reputation for violence now served as a deterrent to outside criminal elements rather than a threat to local residents. The transformation was so complete that when federal investigators later tried to build cases against Bumpy's organization, they found it nearly impossible to distinguish between DeMarco's legitimate community safety work and his criminal enterprise activities. This pattern repeated itself throughout Bumpy's expanded territory. Former rival operators found themselves running what appeared to be legitimate community programs, youth centers, job training facilities, small business development initiatives, neighborhood improvement projects, that also happened to serve as fronts for various criminal enterprises. The beauty of the system was that these weren't really fronts in the traditional sense. They were genuine community programs that also generated criminal revenue, making it impossible for law enforcement to shut them down without also shutting down vital community services that local residents genuinely valued and depended upon. The political implications of this approach were staggering. Traditional anti-crime efforts depended upon community cooperation, residents reporting suspicious activities, witnesses testifying in court, community leaders supporting law enforcement initiatives. But how do you generate community cooperation against someone who has positioned himself as the community's primary economic development engine, its most reliable source of emergency assistance, and its most effective protector against outside threats? Bumpy understood that the fundamental weakness of traditional organized crime was its parasitic relationship with the communities it operated within. Gangsters had always been outsiders who imposed themselves on communities through violence and fear, making them vulnerable to community resistance when law enforcement provided alternative sources of protection. By making himself indispensable to community welfare rather than simply a threat to community safety, he created a form of criminal enterprise that was essentially immune to traditional law enforcement approaches. The long-term consequences of this innovation extended far beyond Harlem. Other criminal organizations began studying and attempting to replicate Bumpy's community integration model, though few possessed the strategic vision, organizational capability, or community credibility necessary to implement it successfully. Law enforcement agencies found themselves forced to develop entirely new approaches to combating organized crime that operated as community development rather than community exploitation. Politicians discovered that traditional tough-on-crime rhetoric was ineffective against criminal enterprises that were also the community's most visible source of positive economic activity. Perhaps most significantly, Bumpy's transformation of organized crime's relationship with community development helped establish patterns of Black economic self-determination that would influence civil rights movement strategies in the following decades. The organizational skills, community networking capabilities, and economic development approaches that he pioneered in the service of criminal enterprise would later be adapted by legitimate civil rights organizations seeking to build Black economic power through community-controlled institutions and businesses.